Muchas gracias. I don't speak Spanish well, but I think that was a very nice introduction, so thank you. I'd first like to take the opportunity to thank the organizational committee and to thank Emma and Mauro and Nico for the invitation and the hospitality for my visit. You know, I've been very impressed by this conference. I've been impressed by the venues. I've been impressed by the presentations. And I want to say, and I've told some of you this, what impresses me the most about this conference and this society is the number of young scientists and students who are doing really amazing and important work. Some of you are in my course that I'm teaching with Carlo. I've spoken with some of you, and I found you all to be very knowledgeable about your study systems and your study organisms. You're very curious and you're very energetic, and this is very important. You're also passionate about wildlife and about mammals and about conservation. So from an outsider seeing this society, I think the future of the society is very, very bright. So I congratulate you on the society. Thanks. Thank you. So what I'd like to do today is discuss some of my research investigating habitat fragmentation and connectivity of mammals, often in urban landscapes. But I would like to start the same way Carlo led his introductory plenary. So now we're at the closing plenary, and I'd like us to think broadly, step back and think broadly about the impacts of humans on our natural world. Now, one way to visualize that impact is to simply look at the lights we create at night from space. And it becomes clear that, first, humans dominate the globe, but also humans progressively live in major population centers. They live in urban areas or cities. In fact, almost all of the expected population growth of humans this century will occur in cities, in urban areas. And about 10 years ago, for the first time in human history, this was in May of 2007, human demographers tell us that for the first time, the majority of people live in urban areas. In fact, more people live in cities today than lived on the planet when I was born a long time ago in the late 1960s. So what are the impacts of this massive human population growth combined with massive transformation of natural habitat to landscapes dominated by humans? Well, we know that habitat loss, degradation, destruction is a primary threat to biological diversity worldwide. This is data that I'm sure you've seen before from the IUCN Red List, where it's identifying threats to species across different taxa. And you can see that habitat loss and degradation is a primary threat to biological diversity, including for mammals. We also know that urbanization is a leading agent of habitat loss and habitat destruction, particularly in urbanizing countries like the United States and to a lesser extent Argentina. This is a dated study, but it's still somewhat of a classic in the United States. What this research team did was investigated the U.S. Endangered Species Act, and they counted the threats facing plants and animals listed as endangered in the United States. And you can see that urbanization, again, is a primary agent of species endangerment in the United States. So in my research group, many of our questions revolve around focus on the impacts of urbanization on the behavior, ecology, and conservation of wildlife. So we study urbanization specifically, but we also study a variety of different human impacts associated with urbanization, or more generally associated with increasing numbers of people on the landscape. So we've done a variety of studies investigating the effects of human recreation on wildlife populations. I have ongoing collaborative work investigating the effects of noise pollution on protected areas and the effects of noise pollution on biodiversity. But perhaps the strongest research effort of my group over the years has been investigating the effects of habitat fragmentation and connectivity, and that's what I want to focus on today. Now, you can see that if you look at some of the titles, it becomes clear what some of my favorite organisms are, and that's mammalian carnivores, or our top predators. Now, we know predators are particularly sensitive to environmental impacts such as habitat fragmentation, habitat loss, because of their large body sizes, which translate into very wide energy requirements and area requirements. They need a lot of land. Translates to low population densities, which means higher extinction probabilities. In addition to those traits, they're often also directly persecuted by humans. So they're very vulnerable to decline and disappearance in landscapes dominated by people and fragmented landscapes. So for that reason, we often use carnivores as focal species to better understand the impacts of humans on our natural world. And this is a sampling of some of the organisms that I've studied over the years. Okay, so what I'd like to do today is talk to you first about our work on urban carnivores. I'll review some survey approaches, and these are very similar to the survey approaches that you do and that I've heard about from you this week. And then I will talk about one of the first research questions I addressed in my work. This actually goes all the way back to when I was a graduate student in the late 1990s, but it helped frame my thinking about fragmentation and about the need for connectivity. So I'm going to review some of this early work and then talk more generally about this idea of connectivity conservation, and then end by giving you some examples of how we model and predict connectivity using animal movement models and habitat models. Okay, so first let's just start with urban carnivores. How do we study carnivores? The same way you study carnivores. We use a variety of different techniques to do this. We use non-invasive techniques such as track surveys and scat surveys. I've done quite a bit of work on non-invasive DNA collected from scat and from hair. A lot of remote camera work, and next I'll be showing you some remote camera photos. We've done telemetry work back in the good old days, putting on VHF collars on animals and tracking them around in the middle of the night, and now putting GPS collars on animals and having satellites track them around. And then finally, over the years, I've become convinced that the only way to really understand the ecology of wildlife, particularly urban wildlife and urban carnivores, and to promote their conservation is to not only understand the animals, but to understand people. Because people are the drivers of the system. And so I've been collaborating more and more with social scientists to better understand the knowledge and perceptions and attitudes of urban residents towards wildlife and towards carnivores, so we can help shape their behavior to promote carnivore conservation. Okay, so I thought it's the last talk of the week. You've seen a lot of talks. To ease into this, for a little fun, I thought I'd show you some remote camera photos of the carnivore community that I study. Primarily, these are from Colorado and California up in the United States, okay? And I'm going to start with a mystery animal. Does anybody want to guess what that animal is? I think I heard it in Spanish. Did you say oso? Yeah, that's American black bear. So this is taken in a study area in Colorado. So our cameras are capturing a variety of different carnivore species across the carnivore community. So large carnivores like black bears. Here we have puma with a GPS collar and a couple of cute little kittens or cubs. So large carnivores. We also have smaller felids. Here we have a bobcat and a bobcat kitten. They're actually going through an underpass under a roadway, a very busy roadway in Southern California. We get the smallest felids we have in these study areas, domestic cats. So this is a domestic cat carrying a wood rat neotoma through an underpass. 2 days later, here's the same cat with a different wood rat through the underpass. Now, I went to the party last night, and I know how much you like to dance. So I can make this cat dance. I thought I'd do that just for you. Okay. We also get canids. So in my study areas, the top canid are coyotes. The wolves have disappeared, so we have a pair of coyotes. Here we have red fox, vulpes, vulpes. This is also a red fox, a melanistic red fox. We have gray fox. This is our gray fox, which is Urocyon cinerio argenteus, carrying a wood rat. We have mustelids, so this is our American badger, more specialists, carnivores. Here's another specialist, small weasel-like carnivore, the western spotted skunk. We have generalist carnivores that do very well in the middle of the city, such as our striped skunk. Of course, we have our common raccoon. Many people feel like these are, particularly children, think these are very cute animals, and I agree they are cute animals. Do you want to see a less cute picture of a raccoon? Okay. A little less cute. And so this is a puma who has killed a raccoon, and this camera was stationed 100 meters away from the urban edge outside of Boulder, Colorado, which is in the urban front range of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. And we got multiple pictures of pumas coming down into the urban edge to forage on other carnivores, including raccoons and domestic cats. Sometimes we capture impending interactions between carnivores. I don't know if you can see this with the lights, but this is a coyote, and this is a domestic cat. And they happen to cross paths right in front of the camera. Now you can imagine who the winner of that interaction is going to be, right? Dog eats cat. And here's a picture of dog eating cat. So this is a picture of a coyote carrying a cat through an underpass in Southern California. And we have a phrase, a picture speaks 1,000 words. One thing I find interesting about this picture is it captures many of my research questions. So I've studied the trophic dynamics and intra-guild interactions between carnivores. I've studied connectivity in highly urban areas. Okay, so enough with the bad pictures. I'll show you now another cute picture. This is of a mule deer fawn. Do you want to see a less cute picture of a mule deer fawn? It's not a fawn, actually. It's just a mule deer. Do you see what that is? That's a head, no body. And there's the coyote. This was taken in Colorado. Either the coyote killed the mule deer, or it might have raided a cache of a puma who had buried the mule deer. Okay, I'll show you another very disturbing picture of a deer. This picture, no kidding, has given me nightmares. Waking up in the middle of the night, seeing those eyes looking at me. This is the last picture. Next one is the last picture, and then I'll move on. But these are the by far most disturbing pictures we get, and those are of all of the people who walk by the cameras. So we're putting these cameras, like you do too, often along recreational trails. Humans use the trails, but so do wildlife. I'm showing you the PG-rated pictures that I can show in this audience, but you can imagine the kinds of things people do in front of cameras. Maybe you've seen them yourself. But carrying knives in the middle of the night, inexplicably dressed as Tom Hanks in Castaway. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, and then I censored these so we don't have to see them. But, so, all of these are interesting photos, but these are data points, and you guys know this. These are data points, and we can ask all kinds of interesting scientific questions with these camera data. So I've had a series of students who investigated the effects of human recreation on wildlife activity and behavior using these camera data. For example, a former student, Shalene George, looked at daily activity patterns of bobcats in relationship to human recreation. and found that in those areas where there's a lot of people during the middle of the day, that bobcats shifted their activity to become more active at night. They became more nocturnal. We've also used these cameras, as you guys have as well, in sampling designs that allow for population estimation. This is work done by Robert Alonzo and Jesse Lewis, who are former graduate students. Robert identified bobcats individually by their pelt pattern and used a mark recapture framework to estimate population sizes. I have had another student, Emily Rule, who did non-invasive genetic surveys for carnivores. In this paper, she set up hair snares. So these are squares of carpet that she put on a wooden block and then put a feather to attract animals, and then also a very bad smelling liquid scent lure to attract animals to the lure, and then they would rub up against the hair snare and leave their hair behind. So here's a bobcat. Here are two coyotes rubbing up against the hair snare. Here's a gray fox having fun on the hair snare. And we can use these data, again, for population estimation. We also looked at genetic variation in gene flow in a fragmented population. Emily also conducted fecal DNA surveys of bobcats in the Santa Monica Mountains. This is north of Los Angeles, to do population estimation. Okay, so one of the, I've suggested this already, one of the first questions that I was interested in when I started my graduate research was to investigate how carnivore species might differ in their sensitivity or their vulnerability to habitat fragmentation and urbanization. And so this early work was conducted in San Diego in Southern California. And you can see here that in Southern California, you have these habitat patches that are surrounded by an urban matrix. So essentially, these habitat patches function as habitat islands immersed within an urban sea. These islands or patches vary in size, and they vary in isolation or connectivity. And so I was interested to examine how size and isolation affected carnivore communities. So just to give you some take-home messages from that work, and it sets up the connectivity research that I've done since. These are logistic regression models looking at probability of occurrence as a function of patch size. So these are the largest patches, these are small patches, and you can see that carnivore species differ considerably in their responses to patch size. Mountain lions needing, or pumas, needing the largest patches, bobcats intermediate in their sensitivities, and coyotes still persisting in a wide range of patch sizes, but declining in very small patches. Now, as you might have predicted, cats actually have a higher probability of occurrence in small patches because these small patches are surrounded by houses, and the cats are coming from the houses down into the habitat fragments. Here's a similar set of logistic regression models, now with isolation. Isolation was measured as the distance from one habitat patch to another habitat patch across the urban matrix. So the larger values here mean that they're more isolated. One result I want to point out here is that mountain lions, or pumas, we did not detect them at all in any sites that were isolated. They absolutely needed habitat linkages and movement corridors to persist in this landscape. Bobcats, again, intermediate, coyotes more tolerant. So we can put these area and isolation curves in the same model to do multiple logistic regression models. So we have probability of occurrence, isolation from connected down to highly isolated, and from small to large. So you can see that for mountain lions, we have this plateau of occupancy in large and connected sites. And it declines to these basins of local extinction in small and isolated sites. So we can actually predict how mountain lions are going to respond to the process of fragmentation, which is starting from large intact landscapes going down to small fragments isolated by a human-dominated matrix. What also becomes interesting is we can compare across species. And so you can see that mountain lions and bobcats occur across a wider range of sites, but they can occur in small patches, but only small patches that are relatively connected. They disappeared in small patches that were very isolated. And then finally, coyotes, they do well in urban areas, but they did decline in small and isolated habitat islands in the middle of the city, completely surrounded by an urban matrix. I'm not going to talk about this work now, but I'll just reference this is where we investigated the impacts of the disappearance of this top predator from this system, the coyote, on food web dynamics. And one thing that we found was this concept of mesopredator release, where top predators, in this case a coyote, declines, resulting in increased activity of smaller, what we call mesopredators, such as domestic cats and gray foxes, species that we know are principal predation threats on a variety of prey species, including ground nesting and shrub specialist bird species. We actually found that in sites with coyotes, that extinction rates of birds was lower. So these top predators might actually benefit prey species through their interaction with mesopredators. Okay, so in my early work, it became very clear, particularly in these urban landscapes, that connectivity was absolutely the key to persistence for these carnivores, particularly the largest carnivores. And so I want to turn to talk more about this idea of connectivity conservation. First, let's define it. There's many different definitions of connectivity. I'll give you one definition. It's probably the most frequently cited definition, and that's a functional connectivity. This comes from the landscape ecology literature by Phil Taylor, and it's the degree to which the landscape impedes or facilitates movement among resource patches. And so the key point here is movement. With connectivity, the more movement, the more connectivity, the less movement, the less connectivity. Movement could be individuals, movement can be genes, movement can be ecological processes, but it's inherently about movement, particularly functional connectivity. What many different empirical studies have shown is that where connectivity is lost, where landscapes become fragmented, species disappear. I certainly found that in my study areas. You're finding it in your landscapes as well. Because of this vision of connecting landscapes with habitat corridors and movement linkages is a compelling one. It's one that's being incorporated in land management plans worldwide. But in practice, in reality, in the real world, connectivity conservation is difficult in landscapes dominated by people. And this is something that we discussed in an edited volume that I worked on with my friend and colleague Sanjan, who's with he's leading Conservation International now. This came out through Cambridge University Press about 10 years ago. So how do we measure and how do we model and how do we predict connectivity? Well, one approach that we've used is development of agent-based or individual-based models. And this is work being conducted by a former PhD student and a former postdoc in my research group, Jeff Tracy. He's now a scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey. The idea here is that the agent is an individual. These individuals are moving through a landscape. They're sensing aspects of their landscape, and they're making decisions about what they sense or what they detect that translate to behaviors. And those are behaviors that we can measure, and those are behaviors that we can model and predict. We can also predict interactions among individuals and look at processes like disease transmission. So in this way, these kinds of agent-based models can be thought of as what have been called computational laboratories. We can manipulate aspects of animal behavior and aspects of the landscape to better understand processes like connectivity. We can manipulate those in a virtual world, in the computer, in ways that we couldn't do in the real world. So the focal species for these agent-based models typically have been our felids, pumas at a large scale, and bobcats at a smaller scale. The basis for these models come from the empirical, the field data we're collecting on the movement behavior of these animals. So here's a bobcat. We've put a GPS collar on this bobcat, and we've let these bobcats go. This is in Orange County in Southern California. Like Disneyland is right here. This is one of the busiest intersections in the United States. It has, I think, almost 25 lanes. It's really, really busy. So we're using these GPS telemetry to better understand how animals navigate through these fragmented landscapes. We've also collaborated with researchers who are studying puma in different area. Here's a puma about ready to enter a big box trap, and it's coming in and gets captured. Here's some resulting telemetry data. This comes from Walter Boyce, who's a researcher and a collaborator. He's at the University of California, Davis, and he's done quite extensive work on puma movement through Southern California. So what Jeff Tracy did was take these kinds of movement behaviors. So this is the day in the life, actually 3 days in the life of a real puma. Well, it's not a real puma. That's a visual of how the puma moved over 3 days. This is in Orange County, California. This is new urban development. I don't want to anthropomorphize, but it appears this animal is moving along the urban edge. Eventually, it ends up back to interior core habitat. What Jeff Tracy did was take those movement paths. So here in red would be the actual movement path. We don't know that. We're sampling that movement path with GPS telemetry data. That's here in white. That's the approximated movement path. And Jeff is developing or has developed quantitative, mathematical, and statistical models predicting animal use, okay, and animal movement. So he's, for example, looking at the distance between successive points, which is a measure of rate of movement. And importantly, he's also looking at the distance and direction to landscape elements, such as urbanization or roadways that animals might avoid or they might be attracted to. And so he's using these movement paths to develop rules of movement. So we can model movement response to urbanization. We can parameterize these models with maximum likelihood approaches, and then use the best models to simulate virtual animals moving through the landscape in somewhat the same way that real animals do. So I thought we could visualize these movement models with just a couple examples. So what I'm going to show here is a home range of a bobcat, B10. This is in Orange County. Again, Disneyland's here. This is Los Angeles. And what we're going to do is simulate the movement of 50 virtual bobcats moving through the landscape in response to urbanization the way that B10 moves in response to urbanization. So we can see these bobcats moving through the landscape. They start to parallel the urban edge. I should say gray is urban. They're paralleling the urban edge. Occasionally they come in and visit habitat patches, which bobcats actually do. They can make it into these isolated habitat patches. And so the idea here is you run these simulations many, many times, and it creates a surface of movement across the landscape. And remember, movement across the landscape is the definition of functional connectivity, so it creates these predictive models of connectivity. So how can we use those data? Well, one thing that we could do is look at these movement models across broader regional scales. So I'm going to show you a couple more simulations to give you an idea of how we might use these models. So this is the study area in Orange County. It's comprised of 8 major core habitat blocks. The biggest block is number 8, and that's the Santa Ana Mountains. And it serves basically as a source population for mountain lions and bobcats. And we've been interested in trying to identify connectivity between the Santa Ana Mountains and these other smaller, what we call satellite habitat patches or core habitat blocks. So we're going to simulate bobcats moving through the landscape, moving through these patches. In this first simulation, they're not going to swim, so they're not going to surf. They're going to, if they hit water, they're going to reflect off the water, and also if they hit urbanization, they're going to move according to urbanization, and they're also not going to be able to travel across roads, okay? So we can simulate all of these bobcats moving through the landscape in roughly the same home range diameter that a typical bobcat might move. Each population is color-coded. If there's movement of colors across populations, that's functional connectivity. That's movement of animals from one patch to another. And it becomes very obvious that 8 Santa Ana Mountains is very isolated, except for some movement between these two populations. And in reality, we know that bobcats do move between these two subpopulations. So we can then quantify in these simulations how many times do animals move from patch 8 to all other patches. And so this is a matrix of the movement from here 8 to all the other patches, and you can see that it is totally isolated except for movement between 8 and 7. Okay? And that is because, in reality, 8 is surrounded by major freeways. Okay? So what can we do? Well, what we can do is put in underpasses. Now, this is theoretical, but in reality, we're doing exactly this, or we've done this in Southern California. So, for example, we've worked with the California Department of Transportation and other land management agencies to put in underpasses along a roadway right here. And we've monitored those underpasses with cameras and telemetry. And we know that animals will use those underpasses. So now I'm going to, in this simulation, perforate this road, make holes in the road with underpasses. So now there are underpasses in this road. And if you run it long enough, you start to see that animals are actually finding and making it through these underpasses. And you're starting to get connectivity. So we can quantify the connectivity, and the addition of those underpasses in those places increased connectivity. That's the general idea. This was just sort of an example of conceptually how we might use these kinds of models. So in all, this mapping of animal movement to geographic space are what are called behavioral landscapes. They're basically spatially explicit depictions of animal movement. And we think these behavioral landscapes can be useful in helping guide conservation planning and identification of corridors through urban areas. These behavioral landscapes can also be used to better understand contact between individuals, both within and between species, and disease transmission. And I'm not going to talk about this work, but for the last, we're going on our 9th year of funding from the National Science Foundation Ecology of Infectious Disease program, who's funded us to understand the interactions and disease transmission between pumas and bobcats and domestic cats in urban landscapes. And we've used these movement models to model some of that contact and disease transmission. Okay, so in conclusion for this part, I would argue that understanding movement behavior is critical to understanding connectivity. It's in the definition of connectivity. And if I go back to this paper and I pull out another quote from it, it says, ignoring movement can lead to incorrect and potentially devastating consequences for conservation. And so I was very much encouraged this week to see many of you, or at least some of you, focused on trying to understand how and where animals are moving across the landscape. I think it's critical. Okay, and then finally, I would like to talk about another approach we've used to model and understand connectivity, and that's the development of habitat models at regional and global scales. So first we'll start at the regional scale, and we'll use the exact same database and the same study system as with the animal movement models. So this is for mountain lions. These are the same GPS telemetry points that I showed you before. And the goal of this work, this was work that was done by my former postdoc, Chris Burdett, was to use GPS telemetry as well as a priori models on the effects of human and natural landscape features on habitat suitability for puma. We did a variety of different model selection approaches to select the best models to predict habitat suitability. So you can generate habitat suitability models like this. These gray here are the GPS telemetry data. The hotter, the red and yellow, are high habitat suitability for pumas. The blue is low habitat suitability for pumas. It's not surprising that Los Angeles and San Diego is not quality puma habitat. It's primarily in the backcountry and the foothills of coastal Southern California. One interesting approach that Chris did in this model, in this paper, was that he collaborated with Dave Theobald, who's a landscape ecologist in Fort Collins, who has developed urban growth models for the United States and actually globally as well. And what we did was intersect the habitat suitability models for pumas with the urban growth models from Dave. And we were trying to predict how future urban growth would destroy suitable puma habitat. And these models predict by the year 2030, an additional 10% of the study area would be transformed to urbanization, and about a third of suitable puma habitat on private land would be lost. So what's happening in Southern California is that pretty much the remnant suitable habitat for pumas is public lands. It's protected lands like Forest Service land, and the private lands are being developed. Okay, and then I'd just like to finish by work that has been conducted in collaboration with my friend and colleague, Carlo, and he spoke of this on the opening plenary on Tuesday, and this is the development of habitat models and fragmentation models at a global scale. So my involvement with this work started when Carlo led an effort to have a series of papers published in a special issue of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. And in that, we calculated, or we estimated, fragmentation and connectivity models for terrestrial carnivores in the order Carnivora. Since then, we've worked to expand that, specifically expand the fragmentation models to all terrestrial mammals. And that was published in PNAS just this summer. So the basis of all of this work are habitat models that Carlo developed in a collaborative way with large teams of experts from the IUCN. So these habitat models start with the geographic range extents of terrestrial mammal species available from the red list. This is the Patagonian weasel. Layers on expert opinion on habitat suitability and GIS layers of land cover and land use and hydrological features and elevation, to develop habitat models that predict high suitability and medium suitability and unsuitable habitat within geographic ranges. And that's an important advancement of Carlo's models, is because it's narrowing the conservation focus to areas predicted to have suitable habitat within the range, which we know is important because we know that habitat is not homogeneously distributed across the range. So what our group did at CSU is we took those habitat models and we measured degree of fragmentation of high quality habitat. To do that, we measured the amount of interior or core habitat for these mammals. We selected what's called the GIS Frag Index, and it basically measures the distance from a habitat patch edge into the interior of a patch. So the farther into the interior, the more core, the more interior habitat, the less edge. So I'll give you an example. This is the Canada lynx habitat suitability model. The darker colors are high quality habitat. The purple are protected areas. We can zoom in here and you can see habitat patches. Again, the darker colors are high quality habitat. And what we did with our fragmentation models is measured the distance into these habitat patches. So again, the farther the distances, the more core, the more interior. We could then sum up, add these fragmentation indices for each 300 meter by 300 meter pixel globally for all species to generate these fragmentation models, these global hotspots of fragmentation for all of the terrestrial mammal species. So here, blue is low fragmentation, red is high fragmentation. You can start to identify where sites have high fragmentation. One thing that was very clear from Carlo's habitat models, as well as this work here, was that it's most, or at least a good proportion of an animal's geographic range is not comprised of high-quality habitat. In fact, averaging across all terrestrial mammals, less than half of a species' geographic range, on average, is comprised of high-quality habitat. And more concerning, less than 5%, less than 4% of a species' high-quality habitat occurs within protected areas. So most high-quality mammal habitat is unprotected, or at least falls outside of IUCN-designated protected areas. Okay, another question we were interested in addressing with this work is to try to predict habitat fragmentation for these mammal species. And we used a series of predictors. We used phylogenetic comparative methods to do this. So for example, in these models, we put range size, we put extinction risk, which we took from the IUCN Red List, which Carlo has explained this week. And we also put a common macroecological variable like body size into the models. And to give you some of the results for this work, so here we're seeing range size as a function of habitat fragmentation. So small ranges, large ranges, low habitat fragmentation, and high habitat fragmentation. The first pattern I'll point out is that as range size declines, habitat fragmentation increases. Okay? Each one of these symbols is a terrestrial mammal species. The symbol color is its extinction risk from the IUCN Red List. The dark dots here are species of least concern, low risk. The more branches, more red branches on a point means that it's a higher extinction risk. So if you just look at it and squint, more red means more extinction risk. And it becomes clear that those species that have small ranges and have high degrees of habitat fragmentation, basically in this quadrant right here, tend to be more endangered. Now we have, many prior studies have shown that small range species have higher extinction risk. This is well known. What this study is suggesting is that habitat fragmentation might contribute to extinction risk in mammals with small ranges. A much easier way to look at the relationship between habitat fragmentation and extinction risk is to graph habitat fragmentation as a function of IUCN Red List status. And it becomes quite clear that species that are least concerned have lower degrees of habitat fragmentation than other species. In fact, in our phylogenetic comparative analyses, we found that species that are classified by the IUCN as threatened have higher extinction risk than least concerned species, even after controlling for variables such as geographic range size or body size. Another interesting pattern that I'll show here is that near-threatened species and data-deficient species also have higher degrees of habitat fragmentation. So this suggests that species that are not well understood or species that are, or at least are near-threatened. They could go either way. They could be downlisted to least concern, or they could be uplisted to vulnerable, but those types of species have higher degrees of habitat fragmentation. And we know habitat fragmentation predicts extinction risk. Okay. These are global models, and they make nice global maps, pretty maps. But in reality, conservation action happens at local scales. And so we've been interested in trying to see how we might apply these models at local or more regional scales. And I'm just going to give you two examples of this at the end of the talk. These are two recent papers. The first is by a colleague, Dan Thornton, that was published last year in Ecological Applications. And the goal was to assess the umbrella value of a jaguar reserve network. And so the question is, to what degree do jaguars act as an umbrella species, so that if you protect habitat for jaguars in a reserve, are you also protecting habitat for other mammal species that occur in that area? So as many of you likely know, in fact, I'm sure you know more about it than me, but international NGO Panthera has been working to design a series of jaguar core areas, and then also they modeled potential habitat linkages or corridors between those core areas. And this is the jaguar reserve that they're trying to implement in some areas now. The question that Dan addressed in this work was he intersected this jaguar reserve to the habitat and fragmentation models of all of the co-occurring mammal species that occur in this area. Okay? A take-home message was that there were 1,500 co-occurring mammal species, and about 70 to 80% of them had at least some high-quality habitat within the jaguar reserve. So the jaguar reserve captured at least some high-quality habitat. Another question that Dan addressed was to look at the percent of high-quality habitat for each species that fell within the jaguar reserve. So here we see percent of habitat from low to high, different mammalian orders, and the take-home message is that on average, somewhere between 15 to 25% of predicted high-quality mammal habitat occurs within jaguar reserves. Dan also did something I think that was interesting. What he did was he compared the amount of high-quality mammal habitat within reserves to the amount of high-quality habitat, mammal habitat, occurring within randomly selected protected areas, actual protected areas, real protected areas that he randomly selected. Okay? And the take-home message from these analyses were that the jaguar reserve was more efficient than random protected areas in containing mammal habitat. So here we have different mammalian orders. This is protected area efficiency, which is how much high-quality habitat falls within these reserves. The X's here are the proportion for the actual jaguar reserve. And the dot and whisker are the proportion of habitat for the randomly selected protected areas. So if you can see, the X's, the jaguar reserves, typically are higher than the random protected areas. Okay? And then finally, he did the same thing, now looking at our fragmentation models. So here, this is low fragmentation, this is high fragmentation. Again, these are the jaguar reserves, these are the random protected areas, and in general, the jaguar reserves were more efficient in protecting less fragmented, more core and interior habitat. So these kinds of applications of our habitat and fragmentation models are useful in evaluating the degree to which they might help guide conservation action. And then finally, I would like to end by just talking briefly about some ongoing work. This is a manuscript that literally we're writing right now. We talked about it today in the course that Carlo and I are directing. We're also going to talk about it this weekend. This is work that's being led by none other than Nico, as well as in collaboration with Mauro and Carlo and myself and our collaborators. And the goal of this work is to, again, use these habitat and fragmentation models to evaluate the effectiveness of Latin American protected areas. It was a similar approach to the jaguar paper I just showed. So these are some figures that Nico has produced. This is Latin America. Each country has a donut chart. In the middle of the donut is a percentage. That percentage is the percentage of land area that falls within IUCN protected areas. Around the donut is, and it's hard to see, but that's okay. Around the donut is what IUCN protected area categories there are. A take-home here is that on average, 23% of terrestrial lands are protected in Latin America, and I should say that this is higher than any other region on the globe. There's quite a bit of variability, though, in the number and the degree of protection of protected areas, ranging from 3.5% up to 54.1%. An interesting approach that Nico used was to evaluate the modeled species richness within protected areas versus outside protected areas for each country. And that's what we're seeing here. There's this delta richness index, which is the difference between the numbers of species with suitable habitat within versus outside protected areas. This is all the Latin American countries, and you can see that almost all of the countries have positive levels of this richness index, which suggests that there's higher species richness or higher, greater numbers of species with suitable habitat within these protected areas. Nico also examined the degree of habitat fragmentation within versus outside protected areas, came up with an index to measure this. Positive indices means that there's lower fragmentation within the protected areas. And again, you can see that most of the countries have lower degrees of fragmentation. They have more intact, high-quality mammal habitat. So again, another potential useful application of these habitat models. Okay, so to conclude, what we're hoping in my research group is that by collecting real data on animals in the field, and then using those data to model the movement behavior of animals and to model habitat suitability at regional and global scales, we hope that these kinds of approaches can help guide conservation priorities and conservation actions for mammals globally. We also specifically hope that they can guide conservation action for carnivores specifically, species that we know are particularly sensitive to habitat fragmentation and which need connectivity for persistence. Okay, I think like every plenary speaker has said, I'm up here talking about work that was done by probably over 100 people. So I like to generally thank all of the people that have been involved with this work, including many graduate students and postdocs and collaborators and institutions and support. I couldn't even list them all, but here are an example. I again like to thank the organizational committee for inviting me here and helping support me, and specifically Mauro and Nico and Emma for your hospitality. Thank you very much.